The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been a subject of much interest in the recent months, brewing countless questions in everyone's mind, but the most important, can this conflict ever end with peace? We are Wiki YouTube, the YouTube platform with the best information about everything in the world. Subscribing to us is free and would be highly appreciated. Let's now see what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. It's crucial to look back at the circumstances that led up to this war. It all began in 1922 with the formation of the Soviet Union, a confederation of 15 republics. The Soviet Union then fell in 1991 due to a number of political and economic factors. Ukraine declared independence on August 24, 1991, and has since distanced itself from its Russian imperial legacy in order to develop stronger ties with the West and pursue democracy. Ukraine has experienced two revolutions since its independence, one in 2005 and the other in 2014. Protesters in both cases rejected Russian dominance and wanted membership in the European Union and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the most recent revolution in 2014, Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president at the time, rejected an association agreement with the European Union in favor of tighter connections with Russia, leading to his ouster from office. Several significant events have occurred since then. Anti-government protests ousted the government in February, forcing Yanukovych to flee the country. In order to reclaim its lost influence in Ukraine, Russia invaded and annexed Crimea the following month. Pro-Russian separatists began capturing territory in eastern Ukraine in April. On July 17, 2014, the rebels fired down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 by accident, killing 298 people. Fighting between the insurgents and the Ukrainian military became more intense. The rebels began to lose ground, and in August, the Russian army invaded eastern Ukraine openly in support of the rebels. All of this has driven Russia's and the West's relationship to its lowest point ever since the Cold War. The Russian economy is on the verge of collapse, and more than 2,500 Ukrainians have been killed as a result of the sanctions. Much of this can be traced back to Ukraine's centuries-long Russian dominance. Ukrainians who see Ukraine as a part of Europe and those who see it as inextricably linked to Russia have split the country more or less evenly. A political crisis within the government as a result of such a dispute may have been unavoidable. Meanwhile, Putin is promoting an imperial revival, nationalist worldview in Russia, in which Ukraine is seen as a part of bigger Russia and as a victim of ever-increasing Western hostility. Not with the current buildup of troops, but with the invasion and annexation of Crimea 8 years ago, Russia began its intimidation of Ukraine. The peninsula continues to be a source of friction between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Ukraine's chances of regaining Crimea look slim. It's uncertain whether Russian soldiers will try to occupy sections of eastern Ukraine, how the conflict will finish, and what this implies for Ukraine's future, as well as Putin's increasingly aggressive but isolated Russia. There are talks with both sides and they seem to be negotiating the terms to come to peace, but these are complicated because they have to consider every move. A single miscommunication may lead to a full-blown war. After the latest four-nation negotiations finished with no headway on ending 8 years of fighting, Ukraine said it would not bow to Russian pressure to deal with Russian-backed separatist leaders. Russia's ambassador said to the press that zero progress had been made and accused Ukraine of making ridiculous ideas. The result was a blow for efforts to settle the larger Ukraine problem, in which Russia has amassed over 100,000 troops near Ukraine's borders, stoking fears of war. Ukraine claims that combat between its troops and rebels in the breakaway, Russian-backed eastern provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk has killed 15,000 people since 2014. Kyiv claims that Russia has forces fighting with separatists inside Ukraine, which Moscow denies. A never-completed peace accord for the separatist crisis in eastern Ukraine has resurfaced amid a Russian military mobilization on the country's borders and mounting fears that Moscow may invade. Representatives from Kyiv and the separatists negotiated a ceasefire in Minsk in September 2014, following a devastating loss of Ukrainian army in August 2014. The document, known as Minsk I, called for a ceasefire to be monitored by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as withdrawal of militant groups, an exchange of prisoners and hostages, an amnesty for insurgents, and a promise that rebel regions would have some autonomy. The deal rapidly fell apart, and large-scale combat resumed. In the Battle of Debaltseve in January and February 2015, the Ukrainian army suffered yet another major setback. High-ranking officials from Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany are gathering in Berlin to discuss how to put the 2015 Belarusian capital Minsk Agreement into effect. The agreement, known as Minsk II, included an OSCE-monitored ceasefire, a withdrawal of heavy weaponry and foreign fighters from the line of contact, and a prisoner exchange. It stated that Ukraine could only reclaim control of the Russian border in rebel areas when they gained self-rule and held OSCE-monitored local elections, which would almost probably keep pro-Russian rebels in power. Putin pays a price for his aggression, but he calculates that the benefits of continuing to bleed Ukraine outweigh the setbacks. Russia will continue to deplete Ukraine's scarce resources by keeping the conflict at a low intensity. As the battle drags on, more of the West's already wary members will become tired of the threat of sanctions and see the benefits of ending their role in the conflict. Putin is clearly dissatisfied with the current situation. Despite not being a member of NATO, Ukraine continues to receive significant weapons and military assistance. As a result, larger guns may be deployed there in the future. The Don-based militants are at a tremendous disadvantage as a result of the TB2 drones. Ukraine is said to be working on its own intermediate-range missiles, capable of reaching Moscow. The Donbass is a historical, cultural, and economic region in southeastern Ukraine, part of which is held by the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, both of which are unrecognized independent nations. Despite this, Ukraine serves as a buffer between Russia and the West, as well as a true test for Europe's future. Whether Europe likes it or not, if Ukraine achieves its Western integration goals and the Donbass conflict is resolved, a freer and more prosperous Europe will emerge. The collapse of Ukraine would be a failure of the West, demonstrating that Russia has free rein to withdraw boundaries, reject the UN Charter's core, rip up signed agreements, and deploy armed aggression without repercussions. The majority of battle against Russian and Russian proxy troops have been carried out by Russian-speaking southeastern Ukrainians, who also account for the biggest number of Ukrainian security forces losses. About 2 million IDPs, or internally displaced people, and refugees from the Donbass speak Russian. Russian is largely killing, hurting, and harming Russian-speaking Ukrainians rather than Western Ukrainian patriots. Among Ukrainian security forces, Eastern Ukraine has the largest percentage of military veterans and highest percentage of casualties. 6 years of Russian military hostility have altered Ukraine's perceptions of Russia and relations with Russia. The annexation of Crimea by Russia and Russia's continued military action in eastern Ukraine have two long-term implications for scholarly studies on Ukraine: the elimination of a pro-Russian East and the collapse of Russian soft power are the first and second consequences. Russian tactics have proved counterproductive since 2013, deepening Ukraine's estrangement. Russia's invasions into Ukraine broke any last fantasies about stability in post-Cold War Europe, leaving Ukraine and the West unsure how to respond. While many decisions could have been made differently, the roots of the conflict were deep, and the causes, both internationally and locally, were considerably more limited than they would have us believe. The implication is that neither declaring Ukraine a sovereign nation nor depending on Vladimir Putin to leave the situation can end the crisis. With everything going on in our world right now, the economy, the non-ending poverty, and especially the pandemic, war is just the worst that could happen. It always results in thousands of casualties, and neither side wants that. It's a looming threat on our planet today that strikes fear in everybody's heart. For now, all we can do is hope for peace. This is Wiki YouTube. If you learned something today, make sure to like and subscribe. See you in our next video.